So thanks for the opportunity to be here, and by your showing others your interest or possible interest in this topic. Um, I'm going to. I have a bunch of slides, but I don't have a polished presentation, and I'll try to tell you why it's so unpolished. Basically, I was trying to think it by putting slides together, but that's different from sort of having thought it through a few times and figuring out what to say. So Jeff Pontetz, the program director, suggested that he'd like a session on crime and punishment. So I thought I'd start with a picture about crime. You know, we're all interested in a good story, good crime mystery. And we have, as Tim mentioned, many examples of headline examples of corporate misconduct, such as some of these listed here. And I thought to start, one way of thinking about this is just to try to get some nomenclature around the various types of misconduct that show up in our literature. So that's what this slide is about. There's a lot of work on what I call financial marketing misconduct, spoofing, insider trading. There's already surveys about this. There's another line of research about financial reporting misconduct. This is stuff that I've been more personally involved in. So this is cooking the books type of activity. Again, so much work in this, there already are surveys in this literature. There's a newer literature on financial advisor misconduct. Here's just a few of the important earlier papers. And I'd call this sort of set of events that have attracted our attention now for the last, I call that, financial misconduct, stuff that fits in our field. And to distinguish that from a whole bunch of other types of business misconduct that also frequently are of interest. So consumer fraud, environmental violations, bribery, and so forth. And if you look at the literature of these other types of misconduct, in the econ literature, it goes back, quite a bit farther back in time. So in thinking about this topic, one approach would be to summarize these different streams of the literature and talk about, where we are now, where we might be going. I'm going to do something. I'm going to sort of take a left turn and instead ask for some audience participation. With this as the background of much of our research, I'm going to talk about, things indicated here. 3 streams of the literature that seemingly are unrelated. I'm going to propose 3 theoretical constructs with which we can begin to hopefully make some sense of how our various concepts and streams of literature might fit together, and which provide a foundation for thinking about future work. And to get started, there's audience participation in this talk. I did say this is an unpolished thing. I'm still sort of sorting this out. And I am most flattered by the youngest member of the audience. This is quite awesome. Thank you. So if I were to ask you just in a word or two, short phrase, what comes to mind as one of our most fundamental concepts, organizing theoretical constructs that help us make sense of the world, that also help define our profession and our discipline? Does anybody have a thought? Greed. That's not on my list. Should have been. I have utility maximization. There we go. Risk. Yeah. Did you say risk and return? Yeah, risk and return. That's sort of on my list too. Yeah. Rational agency. Yeah. So I wish I had those exact phrases, but I do refer to them on my list here. Yeah. Information asymmetry. Yeah. These are, fundamental organizing concepts for what we do. Here's what I have. So I have risk aversion and time preference. The law of one price is a key thing. Jonathan Burke's textbook, for example, is organized around this concept. Information asymmetry. The notion of equilibrium. No one mentioned that. I think that's a key organizing concept in how we think about how the world works. I'm sort of going down my list in terms of the ones I think are even more and more fundamental down here. And I'm going to end up with um, individual agency and intrinsic worth. I think that really, we don't think about that much, but as opposed to some other social sciences, we implicitly assume through much of our modeling that individuals have agency and individuals are all of valid worth in their choices. Here's the one that I'm going to focus on, the role of trust. I think trust, you say, yeah, of course, but I'm going to say, yeah, really, of course, in much of the rest of these slides. And one way I think about that is that every transaction requires a leap of trust. If you build up from the bottom, economics is the study of production and exchange activity over time. People such as Karpoff have been very influential in helping us understand how every transaction puts the transactors at risk. You make yourself vulnerable in many at arm's length transactions. You are vulnerable to holdup problems, opportunism, misconduct, and and this is so fundamental that we don't even think about this in a lot of our modeling, and we certainly don't even think about it. We think, we take it for granted in our daily lives. You go to I just bought a cup of coffee. What a leap of faith this took. Not only that, I get a decent cup of coffee, which, was somewhat fulfilled, but that I wouldn't get poisoned, think about if I had asked for decaf, that's a big leap of faith. How many times have you gone to a restaurant and, late at night you're going, okay, I'd like a cup of coffee, but not the caffeine. And then you go home and you're buzzing after, it's sort of like you're not quite sure what you got. There are tremendous leaps of faith. Think of the supply chain that went into this, all the people involved in the harvesting of the beans. So I'm trusting something. If I have ethical concerns, I'm trusting that that supply chain didn't involve illegal activity or child labor. So these are big deals, which gets to my central question, which is, how do people trust? What gets us to make that leap of faith? Or another way of thinking about this is, why is fraud the exception? Why is misconduct the exception? It's so notable because it is the small minority of events when it comes to human interactions, especially economic transactions. And another way of thinking about this is, what is it that facilitates our ability as communities, as a species, to interact cooperatively instead of being so fearful of others, having such outside fear, outside group and in-group focus, that we end up living in autarky and poverty. This is why I think this is a fundamental question. So I want to start with a definition of trust. And through much of my slides, I'm going to be proposing some concepts here, but I need to acknowledge that I'm wading in deep waters here, where I'm over my head. By deep waters, even talking about the concept of trust has a long philosophical tradition, and the specific definition that I'm going to roll forward with here is not universally accepted. If you look, and I feel like I'm only scratching the surface of understanding things. Now, I think I'm in good company, because when I read the papers in our literature, most of which date back to the 1990s, and involving a lot of the leading scholars in our field, they're also wading in really deep water and writing as if they're unaware of how deep water we are. We're newcomers to a lot of these issues. We as a profession, as economists and financial economists. So here's my attempt with that qualifier. So I'm going to propose that one way we can think about trust is an ex ante belief that when you get into an agreement, an explicit or implicit arrangement with another person, such as buying a cup of coffee, that your counterparty will perform as expected. Now, there's a lot that goes into this. What are expectations? Again, the deep literature in other fields about how these expectations are formed at, say, a very relatively superficial level. If you look at contract law, a contract is not made until there is a meeting of the minds. And there are a lot of tort cases that pivot on how a judge will determine whether there was a whether an implicit arrangement was in fact made. But sort of skimming over some of those complications, sometimes trust is broken. I found these screen games online. And so, this performance doesn't happen. And it raises the question, what happens to your counterparty when they cheat? And I think of there being three large buckets of things that happen. So let's say my barista sold me a bad cup of coffee. Well, there are legal consequences or there are potential. If it's a poison cup of coffee, or if it's coffee made with unsanitary conditions, the local health authorities might close the place down. If there was negligence involved and someone really got hurt, there might be criminal investigation. So there are third-party enforcement mechanisms. There are just the threat of lost business. In a conference center like this, notice that threat of lost business is not as strong as in other settings because I'm a one-time buyer from this thing. But there still are potential reputational effects where you lose future sales. And then there's the individual motivation of the barista themselves in wanting to do a good job and failing to, people are going to differ on that, but failing to do a good job leads to cognitive dissonance, and that there's some disassociation between their self-image, their sense of ethics and purpose in life, and what they've done, leading to shame and guilt and perhaps social stigma. So these three different buckets are pathways of accountability are what provide the vehicle for trust, in that it's the prospect of these consequences that allow me to form trust, that is, to form the ex ante belief that my barista is going to perform as promised. And it turns out that those three different buckets correspond to three different chunks of our literature. Now, in a paper with Quentin DuPont, I should say I should give Quentin a lot of credit here. My colleague is at Georgetown, and I've been trying to think through some of these issues with him. We wrote a paper, sort of an essay type paper, where we propose that there's something called the trust triangle. Now, this is sort of hokey. You can roll your eyes at it. If you will indulge me, I will actually tell you the background on this trust triangle metaphor. There's something called the fraud triangle. Does everyone, who knows of the fraud triangle? Okay, the fraud triangle has a long history in the accounting and auditing literature about three different things that have to be in place for a fraudster to go forward, to commit fraud. And so motive, opportunity, and justification. And I was asked to give a talk at some event in Washington, D.C., and my host introduced me to the head of the enforcement division of the Securities Exchange Commission. Now, this is very sort of an immodest kind of story. I apologize for that. So he introduced me to this head of the enforcement division, and he introduces me as like an expert on fraud, which was my downfall right there, because the head of the enforcement division for the SEC goes, what do you think of the fraud triangle? And I said, what's the fraud triangle? Like completely undercutting any credibility I might have, any claim to any expertise. So I found out about the fraud triangle soon after that, as soon as I could. And so Quentin and I sort of borrow that nomenclature in thinking about the pathways by which trust is formed. And these pathways correspond to those three buckets I had on the prior slide. And we might think of one of these, the third-party enforcement mechanism, as legal capital. That is, laws, institutions, regulations, regulators that help enforce rules that society sets up. The second one is reputational capital. This is the repeat purchase incentive to continue to do a good job. And the third one is what I'm going to call social capital, and that is the personally motivated attempts by each of us to do a good job, where that motivation comes from a lot of different things. Community norms, expectations, personal ethics, culture more broadly. Well, notice that there are big branches of our literature associated with each one of these three different legs. So the law and finance work of LLSV and others are, a huge innovation. And, with the Nobel Prize that was announced a few days ago, is for, three people who also have worked heavily in this area. And, one big takeaway from this branch of the literature is that things that we care about and that we measure, growth, financial prosperity, the development of financial markets, firm valuation, so forth, all are strongly influenced by this legal capital mechanism. Now, that's a very well-developed area. I'm not going to have a lot to say about this leg of the triangle. But the second wave of research, it's a little bit more diffuse. Here I'm highlighting a couple papers up here that I think are very early papers that have been very influential in the stream of the literature. But a lot of our crime and punishment of financial misconduct chunk of the accounting and finance literatures especially fall into this one, where we're talking about market enforcement for misconduct. And then the social capital leg also has a newer, fresher, but also increasingly deep thread in our literature, dating, for example, or a highlight I think would be, nearly 10 years ago, Luigi Zingales calls for a cultural revolution in finance. Well, I'm going to talk about the second and third legs of the triangle, and let me start with this reputational. Now, here I'm on sort of older, more established ground, and then I'll be more on speculative ground in talking about social capital. So what do we mean by reputational capital? Well, I think of it as a present value capital. I love the fact that we use terms like capital, because capital has a lot of different, meanings and different contexts, but very broadly, it refers to an asset. And assets have values, and assets values, and on the present value, future expected cash flows associated with those values. So that's what I think of reputational capital being. It's the present value of the cash flows that accrue from upholding your end of the deal. Lost reputational capital is simply the loss or decrease in present value due to lower numerators here or higher denominators. And it accrues because your counterparties, when you learn that you have lied, cheated, or stole, they will change the terms of contract with you. In the extreme case, they're going to stop doing business with you. I have another story, hopefully a useful anecdote about this. I remember when I was first trying to think about reputational capital, I was at a conference in Hong Kong, and I went to buy some fruit in a little market, and there was a sign, and language was an issue between me and the shop owner, and there was a sign, and I thought this was going to cost me, I forget, X number of dollars. And I get to the little checkout area, and it's going to cost me like 2X. And I said something like, I'm pointing to the sign. The sign says it's this much, and the shop owner, after a while, understanding what I was trying to convey, walks over to the sign above the fruit and tears it down and says, it's 2X, basically. I mean, I understood that much, through the language barrier. The person behind me, who could understand everything that was going on, puts down his cart of items and says, I'm not shopping here anymore. And he said it in English. And he walks out. I thought that was a great, it's funny, that little anecdote, that little personal experience helped me sort of concretize some of these ideas about what reputational capital is and how it works. And that's, extreme example. Now, there are frameworks available to us. There's, the Krebs and Wilson sort of repeat game models. There are other sort of more qualitative approaches to try to capture these ideas. An approach that I'm going to highlight here is from a 1981 paper in the JPE by Klein and Leffler. And it's a paper in which they set up a market in which there's no third-party enforcement. So, you can't appeal to the authorities if someone cheats you. And you have a product that's being sold that is not, for which you cannot determine the quality until after you buy it. And there's no recourse. You buy it, you're stuck with it. Um, and the question is, will fraud just run rampant in this sort of setting? So, so I'm going to present some graphs here. Hopefully, the idea will be somewhat obvious. This is straight from the paper. There are two different levels of quality. These are the cost curves down here for producing the low quality version of the good. You can think of an apple or maybe a cup of coffee. They use an example of a hamburger, the taste of which can't be sort of determined ex ante, and even ex post. It's hard to have a third party enforcer of whether this is a good quality hamburger or not. These are the cost curves for the higher quality production, and you can see that if we just start with this sort of market and provide no recourse, no third party enforcement for cheating, there's an incentive to promise high quality, which is selling at price P1, minimum of average cost for selling or for producing high quality goods. So promising this and selling your goods at P1, but producing along this low quality production line and then gaining this yellow area. And in their framework, this happens one period hence. And so it's the present value of that yellow area. And they propose and then spend some time in the paper establishing that such an equilibrium can exist and the conditions for such an equilibrium that, well, to induce high quality in face of this yellow area incentive, there can be a price premium up here to P2 at which the high quality good is sold. And so the sellers of high quality will sell at P2. Notice that at P2, you're selling above the average cost of producing X2. So you're getting this quasi-rent. Basically, you're selling at a price premium. You get a quasi-rent stream if you continue to sell the high-quality good. And so the gain from not cheating is the present value of this blue area, and they presume that happens for very many periods. So it's the present value of this long-term stream of quasi-rents. Now, there's an adjustment in this model in that, okay, if there's a price premium up here, then the cheaters actually have a bigger potential gain from cheating. It's now this huge red area because now they can promise to sell high quality goods not at P1, but now the high quality goods selling at P2. So now the potential gain from cheating is even bigger. But the main idea that you get from this sort of framework is that, well, there's a gain from cheating. They call it W3. There's a gain from not cheating. They call it W2. And when will cheating occur? Cheating will occur when W3 is bigger than W2. The short-term gain from cheating is bigger than the long-term quasi-rent stream from maintaining your reputation and not cheating. So that's the basic trade-off that people face. Now, this is a framework that provides a rich environment for a lot of extensions. For example, you can think about capital brand name investments in trying to assure or represent or credibly signal that you're the high quality seller. One thing that gets pointed out in this paper is that having a profit stream for the non-cheating firms is by itself not an equilibrium. You're not going to have positive profits, so those have to be competed away. And one way they may be competed away is through brand-specific investments that lose value, depreciate in value, if the cheating happens. So these brand-specific investments can be advertised. It can be, some huge investment in, say, the logo that's associated with this brand, which will lose value if it gets associated with poor quality and dishonesty. So the idea that arises from this is that you will end up having different levels of capital investment in brands, which represent the competitive equilibrium in which positive quasi-rent streams are earned from not cheating. And you'll get different clienteles of investment in guarantees toward not cheating. Now, to try to make some sense out of that long verbiage, I thought I'd give you an example. Okay, so Tylenol is a brand name acetaminophen. So I don't know if I'm going to ask you to think about this a little bit. So if you buy, or if you were to buy pain reliever off the shelf, you generally have a couple of different options. You have the brand name, and then you have a generic version. Andra, apparently, is a generic version of acetaminophen. How many people here are more likely to buy the brand name? A lot of people. How many people would buy the generic version? A lot of people. Okay. That was close to a 50-50 split. So, okay, what we see are clientele effects, right? That generally the brand name is selling for $1 or $2 more. And what is that $1 or $2 more? There have been court cases about this showing that chemically these are the same thing. But nonetheless, we see some people willing to pay that extra $1 or $2 for the brand name. And what are they getting? Well, they're getting an insurance contract. They're paying for the knowledge that these guys, the producers of Tylenol, have a lot more to lose if something gets screwed up in the production process. And is paying for brand name or quality assurance is one way of thinking about this. Take that another step. You can also buy acetaminophen for your kids. So those of you who have kids or thinking about having kids, or theoretically put yourself in the position of buying acetaminophen for your kid, how many people would go with the brand name? How many people would go with the generic? These are people who don't care about their kids, apparently. Okay. So they're chemically the same. The show of hands here, sort of mirrors the market share. So market share for the brand name products in the pharmaceutical market for kids is much larger than for the adult market. You see, a lot of us will say, okay, for myself, I'll go generic. For my kids, I want that extra quality assurance, So we could go through other examples, just driving down the highway and deciding to stop at the local diner or at a franchise, Well, at home, you're much more likely to stop at the local diner. You have the prospect of the repeat purchase mechanism. You have inside information. But if you're on the road, you're a little less certain. It's a higher variance draw if you're going to local diner. And we see that franchises, one thing that they offer is high quality assurance, that is low variability of outcome, even though it might mean low quality, but it's at least high quality assurance. A lot of other examples, Big Four versus regional auditors, VC backers, not. There's a lot of settings here where certification, say, of financial advisors versus non-certified financial advisors, in which we can view these as investments in reputational capital. So there are a couple insights that come out of this framework that I think are useful. One is that we have a precise definition, at least conceptually, of reputational capital. It's the W-2 stream. It's the quasi-rent stream from providing continued high quality. And one way I think about this is that in some ways, reputation is like our dark matter. That, you go back to Adam Smith. He talks a lot about reputation and what gives rise to reputation, and his several different channels. He's very, in his way of presenting things, he emphasizes how many of us are very concerned about our external reputation individually. And he and David Hume, his contemporary and mentor, actually debated on this. Hume was much more likely to argue that people were more intrinsically motivated rather than concerned about how other people thought about them. But you go forward in time, we sort of intuit that enough trust must be there to form cooperative activities, but we really don't know how that happens. So we appeal to terms and concepts, colloquial concepts like reputation. Yet it's really hard to measure this stuff. Hard to really get a good fix on it. And there are attempts to measure it, but they're usually pretty difficult things to measure. CSR ratings, for example, are very poor measures of reputational capital. Survey results, very poor measures. But that leads us to insight number 2, which is that we can observe changes in reputational capital. And so there's this, famous physicist that if you can't see dark matter, look at its effects. Well, that's what we can do. We can look at what happens to firms' reputational capital when they are discovered to lie, cheat, and steal. And that has been the undergirding sort of logic behind a big chunk of our literature, which looks at stock price reactions to cheating. I have an example here. Now, I should say, this example is getting old. I pulled this example from a sample I was looking at a number of years ago, and the example is so good, and it so fits the median case that I've flogged this example a lot. But I thought I'd show it to you again. It's a case in which Xerox was cooking its books for about a 3-year period, beginning in early 1997. And what it was doing, it was accelerating revenue recognition for leasing of its equipment, say copy or leasing. And so it would book the full stream of expected lease payments when they got the lease agreement. And what that did was it boosted reported earnings for a while. And, this kind of accelerator revenue recognition scheme, you can't keep rolling it forward unless you really have true underlying high growth. And they did not have high enough growth to support this. So after nearly 3 years of doing it, they announced that, hey, we can't keep this up. And they revised their earnings projections. The stock price took a dive as investors sort of figured out very quickly what was happening. And then there was approximately a 10-year period or 7 additional more years period in which the firm was investigated for cooking the books. There were people who went to jail or had criminal charges, I should say. The firm paid legal settlements, both to class action lawsuits and to the Department of Justice. So it was a big fiasco. And what I've done is I've taken this plot of abnormal returns and I've stylized it a lot. Let's see. I have the wrong, whoops. It's not showing up. That's the problem. There's a disconnect between my Apple and this machine. So what I intended to show here was a very stylized version of that price path. And basically, I have a straight line here. I think I'm going to ask you to imagine. So I've simplified that previous pattern where first there's a, uptick as they're cheating and then the downtick, and I'll go back to the actual path here. The downtick is much larger than where we started out. It's sort of like when they're discovered to have cheated, they don't merely go back to a price path that they otherwise were on. They lose a lot more than that too. And that's sort of a median type observation when you see firms discovered for having cooked their books. And in very broad terms, I guess maybe I will refer to this one rather than the hypothetical price path. What you see is that this big price drop here can be decomposed into a couple of different components. First, it's coming back to where we might have been otherwise, the hypothetical counterfactual, plus a loss due to the prospective penalties, plus this lost reputational capital. And that reputational capital in these types of measurements is a residual measure. It's like the stuff that we cannot otherwise explain away. And going back to this set of numbers, the lost reputational capital is about 67% of the total loss. So it's the lion's share of the loss. And that was one takeaway that I think comes out of this literature, that for many types, but not all types of misconduct, the lost reputation, that is the lost future sales or higher future cost of capital, swamps any sort of legal settlement. And in these cases, these guys did pay like $500 million in legal penalties, but that was peanuts compared to their higher cost of capital. Okay, I have a couple slides here that show that this shows up in sort of larger samples. If you look at the losses that firms experience when they're discovered to have cooked their books, you do see these legal penalties. You see this readjustment back to the hypothetical counterfactual. And then you see the big part of it is lost reputation. You can, there's a bunch of work here. This list, I sort of got tired and stopped listing additional papers there that I should have on this slide, and apologize if your paper is not on this slide. But a lot of work that shows exactly how these losses occur, both lower cash flows and higher cost of capital. This type of work has been done in other types of misconduct, for example, product recalls. And you see the same sort of thing. Product recalls are very expensive. Typically, these samples are drawn from pharmaceutical and automobile manufacturers. And if you have to recall, a product, the direct costs of fixing, say, a catalytic converter on a car or something, that's very costly for a fleet of cars. But still, those direct costs are very small compared to the lost future sales. Frauds of private parties, like consumer fraud, same sort of thing. And then how about environmental violations? Here I didn't show you the pie chart yet, just to ask you what you think it might be. Do you think for environmental violations, do you think firms suffer similarly large reputation losses? And the answer, at least from now data that are now seeming very old and creaky, the answer has been no, that these firms on average lose, depending on the sample, say 1% of market cap, but that percent is fully accounted for by the direct costs that are imposed on them, say, to clean up their messes. Now, this may change over time, but it highlights the difference in mechanism, or how the mechanism of reputational capital works. It's got to be that the people who are harmed are people with whom the firm does business. Third parties who are harmed, say downstream users of water, if the firm is dumping some effluent in a stream, those people do not have a market mechanism with which to have a penalty imposed on the cheating firm. So there's a bunch of topics for work that I think come out of this type of thinking. For example, there's I think a lot of, as I talk to people, I think a lot of conjecture that maybe because of motivated consumers and motivated investors, such as impact investors, that maybe the cost of environmental violations are now positive, the reputational costs are positive. I won't go through these in detail, but just want to point out that there are a number of areas that I think are just begging for additional work in thinking about reputational capital, extending the broad and increasingly broad base of literature that simply documents that there are these reputational costs for some, but not all types of misconduct. I'd like to spend some time on the third leg of this triangle too, and that is this concept of social capital. And to do this, the first thing I want to do is make sure that I don't bore you by droning on too long. So I think I'm sort of on target. And I want to encourage whatever comments you have. Please feel free to interrupt me. So I propose that this is a third wave of research, and I've been sort of focusing on what I think are sort of higher level ideas around this idea of trust and how trust is formed and how broken trust is enforced and penalized through these three legs of the triangle. But I've tried to, on these slides, I've tried to put a number of citations as well to emphasize that they're, the nature of the work that's being done in each of these areas. So, for example, it's widely accepted that there are these non-pecuniary influences on the things that we typically care about and measure, to what I'll call economic outcomes. And this goes back at least to the previous generation of economists. Kenneth Arrow famously has pointed this out, that virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust. This is just one of several passages that you can quote from Arrow's writings about the importance of trust. Glenn Loury introduces the term social capital in his writing, one of his early papers. And then starting in the 1990s, we see emphasis both outside and then within the world of economics and finance that use concepts such as social capital and tie social capital measures to outcomes such as economic development and firm valuation. And I think of these as being sort of three leading early papers in this area, sort of foundational papers. I thought I'd just point out some of the things that we think we have learned from the literature up to this date. So I have 5 different categories of findings, just to illustrate the types of things that people are reporting and that I put into this category of research. Cheaters got to cheat. So there's a lot of evidence that managers who cheat outside of their business lives also cheat inside their business lives. An important finding in this literature is this paper by Klein, and Walkling that shows that, okay, yeah, managers who say get a lot of parking tickets or have extramarital affairs or have cheated on their resumes and lied on their resumes, they are more likely to also be the managers who oversee accounting scandals. So, okay, that's what these other people are also showing. But interestingly, these guys also show that matters at the firm level only when the manager's activities undermine trust with the firm's counterparties. So managers who get into some legal fiasco on their own, say, they're found to have cheated a brother-in-law out of an inheritance, that doesn't have firm effects unless the counterparties view this as undermining their ability to do business with the manager. And I think that's an important connection here. Here's another finding, that social connections matter. Increasingly, I've noticed from other disciplines that in thinking about influences, they've added to nature and nurture the notion of neighborhoods. So nature, nurture, and neighborhoods as being fundamental influences. By neighborhoods meaning the social communities, which is, I guess, a subset of nurture in terms of influencing outcomes that we care about. Well, this neighborhood effect certainly can happen at a long-term measure. So Jardine Liu, for example, has this paper that shows that the country of origin for a CEO, countries of origin, even going back multiple generations, are associated with different levels of trust or corruption. There are different corruption indices that you can use for different countries. That is associated with the likelihood of financial misconduct at the firm level. Francesco Duconto has this paper that I think is really interesting about how the degree of anti-Semitism in different areas of Germany is associated with sort of the absence of demand for financial products. And so we see that at the long term, but we also see these short-term social interactions being really important. I've got a couple of, I think, very well-known papers in our literature here. This is a paper that was new to me, that even like at the national level, winning important victories for local, for national football teams was associated with an increase in willingness to trust out-group individuals. And that persists for some period and eventually goes away, decays. Finding number 3 is formative experiences matter. So, we have the Melmendia and Naval papers about experience affecting financial risk and inflation expectations. So, Duchin, Simtin, and Soria have this paper on a CEO's exposure to gender diversity in their formative years, or even as adults, is associated with their treatment of women as in their leadership positions. social capital reflects both global and local influences. So we have a lot of the very early work in this area looked at national differences in measures of social capital and outcomes. But Parsons, Suleiman, and Chipman have a couple of papers that point out that even say within the United States, there are regional differences in measures of trust, and there's several different measures that they use, and those are associated with outcomes such as the propensity of local firms to commit misconduct.
You said sort of interactive with that.
Please do.
I was going to say that, a lot of these studies seem to be about
There seems to be a
indoctrinated in turn.
Mm-hmm.
And I bet that, for example, Professor Persologists, the indoctrinated experience perhaps due to its trustworthiness are mostly like, so as younger scholars probably, we have to establish that trust that we have. Then if you suggest we do, we have similar interests, what?
Yeah, okay. So a very applied question about formation of reputational capital. Yeah. So, it's funny because this is an issue that comes up a lot in settings outside of like this kind of deal where say you have a panel of editors that are meeting with junior scholars. So there are panels like that happening at this conference. And this kind of question comes up a lot. And there's a lot of standard answers. And you want to break I want to break beyond the standard answers first by acknowledging that those effects are real. I mean, you really do. There are times where you look at a paper and you say, okay, if this had a more established name on it, its chances would be better. And so, I want to acknowledge that. I think that really, I see that effect, when I see papers coming through the review process. So, having said that, like the only thing you can do is make the best darn paper you can make. That's really the only thing that each of us can do. I do want to also acknowledge that I think everybody really battles, and this is off topic here, but everybody really, really struggles hard to place papers in good journals. I mean, it's just such a time demanding, sweat demanding, frustrating experience. I think even for people who you might say, oh man, they've got it easy. It's hard for everybody. So back to topic here. Let me go to finding number 5. It's about social capital spillovers. I like this, finding from Giannetti and Wang, for example, that if there's fraud happening at a company that is in your geographic area, you're less likely to invest in the stock market, and you're less likely to engage in trust-based activities. Quentin DuPont, my co-author, has a couple of papers where he finds that scandals involving social institutions, sort of like rattling one's trust in a broad sense, affects people's willingness to participate in the stock market, or affects firms' willingness to trust by providing trade credit. So now that's an attempt to summarize some of the findings from this literature, but I've skimmed over what I think is a really important issue, which is that what do we mean by social capital? It turns out that there are a lot of different terms people are using and sort of tossing around. And so I've tossed around these terms: social capital, trust, generalized trust, private trust, social norms, culture, reputation. You see the papers in this area using these terms, sometimes with a real eye to trying to define what we're talking about, and sometimes a little less precise notion. I'm struck by one of the very early papers in this area has this line toward the beginning. It says, trust, cooperative norms, and associations within groups each fall within the elastic definitions that most scholars have applied to the term social capital. When I stumbled over that line, it was sort of like, yeah, even from the beginning, we've known that we have these elastic definitions. That is, complete ambiguity about what it is we're talking about, sometimes causing us to talk past each other. So what I'd like to point out is that there are these ambiguities. What is social capital? Some people think of it as institutions and values. Or is it the same as trust? Is it different? Is it the same as culture? Is it different? And down here at the bottom, I want to pose a question that I'd like to talk about for the next 5-10 minutes before end. It'll be 10 minutes, sorry. And if it's more than that, Tim, you should give me the hook. Can we build a construct that helps us sort out these different issues conceptually, thereby providing a foundation for future work? That's what I would like to do. Now, I don't think I have done that, but here's how far I've tried to push the ball so far. So I'd like to start with the term culture. What do we mean by culture? Well, Acemoglu and Robinson, in one of their papers, which got cited in the Nobel announcement, quote an early sociologist as defining culture as a stable and coherent normative pattern of value orientations that help individuals make decisions and adapt to different circumstances. I think that's a good definition. I'm going to go with that. It's a definition that also is consistent with a lot of other attempts to try to put a few words to this very important but nebulous concept. There are some observations that come out of this. Culture tends to be sticky, that, it's associated with communities, even though it operates at the individual decision making. It operates at the level of me deciding to trust my barista, for example, even though it's something that is defined at the community level. What contributes to this normative pattern of value orientation? Within our literature, there's been a lot of emphasis on 3 different types of things that drive culture. So characteristics of the individual, firm which they work, coworker characteristics and influences, geography-based measures of norms and sanctions. And this geography-based stuff can be like within regions in Italy, or across different cities in the United States, or across different countries, and then related to that is religion. So within countries, different religions or different predominant religions across different countries, providing different sources of culture or sources of normative patterns of value orientations. I want to propose that we make explicit a 4th bucket, which is just personal values, personal ethics. And here's a slide that illustrates why I think we need to make a case for this 4th bucket. I have here 3 different quotes from 3 important papers in this area, in which researchers try to define culture. And I notice that in each of these examples, and in many other examples that you can find, that they leave out cross-sectional variation across individuals in the defined groups, and that idiosyncratic variability across individuals is my argument for why we need this 4th bucket, that we don't want to ignore this variation within groups that's attributable to just individual variation in ethical North Stars or ethical compasses and how that operates. So I think that's important to include this. So I'm going to include that in my definition of culture, and then try to tie that to social capital. What do we mean by social capital? Well, I'm going to exploit the notion that social capital, the term, has the word capital in it. And capital, again, typically in our language, in our models, refers to an asset. I'm going to think of social capital as the present value of cash flows that accrues from the present value of the stream of, instead of pecuniary cash flows, non-pecuniary cash flow, non-pecuniary quasi-rents that accrue from maintaining your end of the deal and not acting opportunistically. So stepping back a moment, if we can think of reputational capital as a present value of quasi-rent stream that is expressed in monetary terms, I continue to buy coffee and other people continue to buy coffee from this barista. Social capital is an analogous present value of the quasi-rents, but in non-pecuniary terms. That is, in self-image, the value of self-image being aligned with the person's activities, which hopefully have some ethical screen. The present value of the non-pecuniary benefits of social status. Excuse me. One way of thinking about this is that the connection between culture and social capital is that social capital is a value of the embodied culture. And to be a little bit more precise, it's the portion of the value of the embodied culture that is at risk, or that may be lost if opportunism happens in each individual transaction. And again, it resides in individuals, but it can be aggregated and measured across groups, say across geography or across nations. And something that I think we want to think about is interaction effects across individuals. I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, how does trust arise out of this? Well, trust in this way of thinking about things and trying to sort out these concepts is not an innate characteristic of any individual community. It's the outcome. It's the outcome of investment in all three legs of this triangle. So this is, I think, one of the things I'd like to leave you with as worth pondering, and which might help organize some research going forward. I have a couple of attempts to flesh this out some more, but the main idea is that trust and social capital are not interchangeable terms, as we frequently see in the papers I've cited up to this point, but rather trust is the outcome of all three legs. Here's a starting point of an attempt to tie this together. I don't think I'll sort of walk you through this model, other than to point out that I'm going to use this symbol pi to refer to the trust of one actor, who I'm calling B, in their counterparty A. So it's the subjective likelihood in B's mind that A is going to perform as promised. So 1 minus pi is the chance of opportunistic activity. And you can set up a problem here in which you could consider B's incentives. You've got A's incentives to invest in capital, excuse me, to increase their counterparty's trust in them, and thereby to increase the chance of earning whatever surplus is at stake in that individual transaction. And those capital investments, or investments that generate trust, can be through legal capital, that's L here, or reputational capital, or social capital. Social capital being the fuzziest one here. I gave the symbol X. So I won't go through the development of this model, but the main intuition here is that you've got three different main pathways by which trust is formed, social capital being only one of them. And the idea of setting up a framework like this is that you can begin to understand the interactions between these various things that contribute to trust formation. Let me give you a couple of examples. So, comparative statics. I'd say 90% or so, maybe more, of the papers that I've been reviewing in this sort of social capital literature, in a chunk of our literature, look at this partial derivative and basically say, hey, when social capital or their measure of social capital goes up, trust goes up. And some economic outcome results from that. There are these huge potentially huge interaction effects, these indirect effects. And the kind of questions that we might consider is substitution effects. So let's say we fix the total level of trust in that transaction at a given level. You think about, okay, what's the impact of increasing legal sanctions for misconduct, or increasing the security of property rights, or increasing the functioning of our legal institutions. So L goes up, legal capital goes up. Well, there's a lot of literature outside of our area, so in the law literature especially, that just presumes that more laws, more trust, better outcomes. That may not be what's going on here. There might be these interaction effects. More laws could mean less investment in reputational capital, could be less reliance on social norms and social capital. We could do the same thing with what happens if social capital goes up. There might be impacts on reputational capital. Again, here I'm suggesting that there might be substitution effects, but I have a slide here. I hope I didn't already go by. Yeah, I already went by it. That suggests that there could be complementary effects as well. And we can easily think of scenarios in which that might be. So, for example, if we have stronger out-group motivation and ability to cooperate in a community, it seems to arise in a lot of situations where people engage in cooperative behavior and it's associated with economic progress. Well, maybe the mechanisms that give rise to that also give rise to incentives to invest more in reputational capital. Or maybe they substitute it. These I think are the interesting questions in better understanding what drives trust, what drives the economic outcomes we're interested in. And then if you're interested in just the crime and punishment aspect of this whole chunk of the literature, what breaks down to motivate crime? Yeah.
I think around trust, you specifically mentioned that it's an outcome there. It can also be one part how it has implications on each of those two items because, for example, in the U.S., there's a decrease in that trust in the leaders. And so it's a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah. So, maybe tell me if the next couple slides just capture this idea. Here's my way of thinking about the current state of our literature. We have these parallels, sometimes overlapping, but still somewhat siloed approaches that examine each leg of this triangle. And again, if you go through, so Quentin and I have actually spent an afternoon once doing this, just sitting down saying, what essentially is this paper doing? And again, over 90% of the papers were, say, looking at change here and its impact on trust and thereby some economic outcome, such as economic development, or this. And what about first substitution effects? You increase one, you get less of others. Or what about complementary effects? You increase one, say legal capital, and you get more of the other. Or it could actually be the other way around. We do see a positive correlation between measures of social capital and measures of legal capital. So LLSV measures, for example, of legal capital and world survey, world values survey measures of social capital tend to be positively correlated. Or what about these interaction effects? I think that's I couldn't figure out how to draw interaction effects better than this. So it's a very busy diagram. So I think these are the future directions that seem to me to be very much underexploited. So again, I don't know if you noticed the title of the previous couple of slides are future directions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go back and just highlight what those titles say. To what extent do we have substitutability going on? To what extent do we see complementarity going on between these three different legs? And how does that affect each of the sort of narrow focus approaches that we've seen so far in the literature? Number three, how do they overall interact in building trust and generating the outcomes that we're measuring? Number four is a different sort of qualitatively different kind of question in that it's the question about when does this whole mechanism break down? And And how do you characterize those situations? And in a very broad sense, basically in this trust model, when A's estimation of the losses that they will suffer if they cheat is inconsistent with B's expectations. Basically, B has trust that's misplaced because the gains of cheating to A are bigger than expected. And there are many situations in which that can arise. Okay, and then finally, measurement. This is, I think, another area that's ripe for innovation, especially in this world of big data. I'm very impressed with large language model approaches that people are applying to this literature. Geolocation data, cell phone traffic, and these I think are examples of ways that we're moving forward. Robert Solow had a very sort of critical take on this book by Francis Fukuyama, which is titled Trust. So Fukuyama is not an economist, but wrote a book that economists have been interacting with ever since. And Solow was initially sort of skeptical, partly by saying that, this looks like more of a buzzword than anything. If it's going to be useful to us, we've got to be able to measure it. And that has, helped spawn the 30 years of research since then. And I do want to point out that there are a lot of different ways that people have been trying to measure social capital. Each of them has its own flaws. We're, I think, as a profession, trying to do the best we can, trying to see if there's any similarities across these measures, I think has some fruitful possibility. And I do want to point out that in an earlier research sort of survey, it's not showing up. It's another picture here that I think in translation to this Windows machine didn't translate, but it's simply a copy of a table where we show different types of outcomes that people have examined so far, crossed against different measures that have been used, say geography-based or religious-based or social contact type-based measures. So it's a big attempt to summarize the literature. So I should stop, and thank you for your patience. Here's what I want to leave you with. I do have one more slide after this, but this is sort of my organization of what I've tried to put into the stew of discussion here, that we have three seemingly unrelated or only partly overlapping chunks of the literature that I think are very much related. They're siloed to this point, and part of our future going forward, I think, is going to be to break down these silos and see how their interaction effects between legal, reputational, and social capital. And I proposed a couple different constructs. The one that is most established are the reputational capital models, such as Klein and Leffler, or such as repeated game theoretical models. The trust scenario that I want to leave you with, I think I'll jump to the last slide here. If there's a single takeaway that I'd like to leave you with, it's simply that we can start to gain purchase and push this literature forward through an attempt to sort out what we mean by these different fuzzy terms. And here's my attempt at my proposal, which is that trust is the outcome of people's investments in legal, reputational, and social capital. It's not the same as those things. Certainly not the same as just social capital. I trust someone in a specific relationship and a specific transaction. So, like, I trusted my barista to do this, but I may not trust that same barista in other types of transactions here, such as a loan. Social capital is one thing that generates trust, but it's not the only thing. And considering the other things that generate trust, I think will help us gain insight into the functioning of social capital as well. Let me stop there.